He found the small, round pills hidden under her bus seat. Then, her daily tears started to make a horrifying kind of sense. For weeks, the bus driver, a man whose route had etched itself into the rhythm of his mornings and afternoons, had watched the young black girl. She was small, always sat alone, a few rows behind him, by the window. Every day, the same quiet sobs, her shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly, her face turned towards the glass, as if the passing world could absorb her sorrow. He'd tried a gentle smile once or twice, a soft, "good morning," but her eyes, when they briefly met his in the rearview mirror, were like deep wells of unshed rain, quickly darting away. He was a man of routine, not interference. His job was to get the children to school and back home, safe and on time. That was the boundary. But the sight of her, day after day, a small dark shadow in the bright yellow bus, began to wear him down. It wasn't just sadness. It was a kind of fear he saw in her, a brittleness that made his own heart ache with a nameless anxiety. He'd mentioned it to a colleague, another driver, who just shrugged. "Kids have problems," the colleague said. "Don't get involved." Sound advice, probably, but the image of her tear-streaked face, pressed against the cold window, wouldn't leave him. He started noticing other things: how she flinched if another child accidentally bumped her, how she always carried her backpack clutched tight to her chest like a shield, how she never, ever spoke. The silence around her was as heavy as her gaze. He began to dread her stop, not because of her, but because of the helplessness that washed over him as she'd step off the bus, her head bowed, and walk towards a house that, from the outside, looked like any other on the street. He'd find himself watching until she was inside, a small knot tightening in his stomach each time the door closed behind her. What happened in these houses? What secrets did they keep? He'd shake his head, tell himself it wasn't his place. But the questions lingered, like the faint scent of old crayons and packed lunches that always clung to the bus seats. Then came the day he was doing his end-of-route check, sweeping up stray papers and forgotten lunch bags. He ran the broom under her usual seat, the one by the window, third row back on the right. Something small and light skittered out. He bent down, his knees creaking. A small foil-backed packet, birth control pills. Not a full month's supply, but a strip with several missing. His breath caught in his throat. He picked it up, the plastic cool against his palm. He looked at the empty seat, then back at the pills. It was like a key turning in a lock, opening a door to a room he had desperately hoped did not exist. The crying, the fear, the hunched shoulders, it all clicked into place with a sickening thud. This wasn't just a child's sadness. This was something else, something dark, something adult. A wave of cold anger washed over him, quickly followed by a profound sense of unease. What did this mean? Who had given them to her? Or had she taken them? And why? The questions were a swarm in his head, each one more disturbing than the last. He stood there, in the silent, empty bus, the forgotten pills a heavy weight in his hand, the silence suddenly deafening. The boundary he had so carefully maintained felt like it was crumbling. He couldn't just sweep this under the rug, or under the seat. He couldn't just drive away and forget. The image of her small, tear-stained face was seared into his mind, no longer just a sad child, but a child in desperate need. But what could he do? Who would even listen to a bus driver with a wild suspicion? He closed his hand around the packet, the foil crinkling softly. He had to do something. The thought was no longer a question, but a certainty that settled deep in his bones. The quiet dread he'd felt for weeks now had a name, and it was terrifying. The next morning, the small packet of pills felt like a burning coal in his pocket. He drove his route, the familiar streets seeming alien, shadowed by his new knowledge. When the girl got on, her eyes red-rimmed as usual, he felt a fresh stab of pain, of anger. He wanted to say something, to ask her, but the fear in her gaze, deeper today, perhaps, or maybe it was his own perception that had sharpened, stopped him. He knew he couldn't approach her directly. It might make things worse, might scare her into silence, or worse, put her in more danger if someone found out she'd spoken. He had to go to the source, or at least who he presumed was the source of authority in her life, her stepfather. He'd seen the man a few times, waiting for her at the bus stop in the afternoons, or sometimes the mother. The stepfather was a big man, often unsmiling, with a way of looking at people that made the driver uncomfortable even from a distance. He decided he would try to speak with him that afternoon. The school day felt endless. Every child's laugh, every shout seemed to mock the silence and fear that clung to the small girl. When he finally pulled up to her stop, his heart was pounding. The stepfather was there, leaning against a beat-up car parked at the curb. The driver took a deep breath, killed the engine after the last child, the girl, had stepped off. He watched her walk towards the man, her steps slow, hesitant. The man didn't smile, just gestured curtly with his head for her to get in the car. Now or never. The driver opened his door, stepped out onto the pavement. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice sounding rougher than he intended. The stepfather turned, his eyes narrowed. He looked the driver up and down, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. "Yeah? What is it?" The driver walked closer, trying to keep his tone even, non-accusatory. "It's about your daughter," he began, then corrected himself. "Your stepdaughter, the girl who rides my bus." He saw the girl freeze near the car door, her eyes wide, fixed on him. Fear, pure and undiluted, radiated from her. "What about her?" the stepfather said, his voice flat, impatient. "I'm just concerned," the driver said, choosing his words carefully. "She seems very unhappy, cries a lot on the bus. I was wondering if everything is all right at home." He didn't mention the pills. Not yet. He wanted to gauge the reaction first. The stepfather's expression hardened. A humorless smile touched his lips. "She's a sensitive kid, always crying about something." "It's none of your business, driver. You just drive the bus." The dismissal was cold, absolute. "I found something," the driver pressed, feeling a surge of desperation. He couldn't let it go this easily. Under her seat, some pills. He saw a muscle twitch in the stepfather's jaw. The man's eyes, already cold, seemed to turn to ice. "Pills? What are you talking about? She doesn't take any pills. You must be mistaken." He took a step towards the driver, his bulk suddenly more menacing. "Maybe you should stick to driving and stop imagining things, or sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." The threat was unspoken but clear. The driver stood his ground, though his insides were churning. "I'm not mistaken," he said quietly. "I just want to make sure she's okay." The stepfather let out a short, harsh laugh. "She's fine, perfectly fine. Now, if you'll excuse us." He turned his back on the driver, opened the car door, and nudged the girl inside. She scrambled in, not looking at the driver, her face pale. The car door slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. The stepfather got into the driver's seat, started the engine with a roar, and pulled away from the curb, leaving the bus driver standing there, a cloud of exhaust fumes stinging his eyes. He felt a profound sense of failure. He had tried, and he had been shut down, dismissed, subtly threatened. The man's denial was too quick, too aggressive. It wasn't the reaction of a concerned parent. It was the reaction of someone with something to hide. And the look on the girl's face when she saw him talking to her stepfather, it wasn't relief. It was terror. He had made it worse. The thought hit him with physical force. He had alerted the man, and now whatever was happening, the girl might pay the price for his interference. The weight of that possibility was crushing. He got back on the bus, the silence amplifying his unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of something terrible. His gut screamed at him that this was far from over. He couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the girl's terrified face, the stepfather's cold, dismissive glare. The man's words, "She's fine," echoed in his mind, laced with a menace that made his skin crawl. Fine? No, she wasn't fine. He knew it with a certainty that went bone deep. The next day the girl wasn't on the bus. Her seat was empty. A cold dread seeped into him. Had he caused this? Had the stepfather kept her home because of his questions? Or was it something worse? He drove the route with a knot in his stomach, his eyes constantly scanning the familiar streets, looking for any sign of her. Nothing. The day after, still no sign of her. The empty seat seemed to mock him. His worry gnawed at him, growing with each passing hour. He thought about calling the police or child services, but what would he tell them? That a girl cried on his bus and he found some pills? That her stepfather was unfriendly? He imagined their skeptical questions, the forms, the bureaucracy. He had no proof, only a terrible feeling, and a discarded packet of pills that the man had already denied. He felt trapped, helpless. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that if he didn't do something more, something concrete, he would never forgive himself if the worst happened. The third day, his shift was almost over, the sun beginning to dip low, casting long shadows. He was driving past her neighborhood, not on his route, but drawn there by an anxiety he couldn't control, and then he saw them. The stepfather's beat-up car, parked a few streets away from their house, facing in the direction of the old city park. He saw the stepfather get out, go to the passenger side, and open the door. The girl. She got out, her movements stiff, her head down. She looked even smaller, more fragile than he remembered. He felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline. This was wrong. Why weren't they going home? Why here? Without a conscious decision, he pulled his own car over to the side of the road, a good distance back, keeping them in sight. He had to know. He had to see where they were going. It felt like he was crossing another line, stepping further into a place he shouldn't be, but the image of her small, hunched figure walking beside the large, imposing man erased any hesitation. The stepfather put a hand on her shoulder, not gently, and steered her towards the entrance of the park. It wasn't the main entrance, with the playgrounds and the picnic tables. This was a less used access point, leading to a more overgrown, neglected part of the park, dense with trees and tangled underbrush. His heart began to pound. This wasn't a father-daughter stroll. This felt furtive, planned. He waited a few moments, then started his car and drove slowly, following the direction they had taken, his eyes scanning the tree line. He parked again, out of sight of the path they'd taken, and got out. The air was cool, the park quiet except for the distant sounds of traffic and the rustle of leaves. He moved cautiously, trying to be silent, feeling like a stalker, but pushed on by a sense of urgent dread. He followed the faint trail, his senses on high alert. Where were they going? What was in this deserted part of the park? He pushed aside some low-hanging branches, and then he saw it. An old maintenance shed, dilapidated, its paint peeling, windows boarded up or broken. It stood in a small, forgotten clearing, and standing outside it, talking in low voices, were 3 other men. His blood ran cold. These weren't park employees. They looked rough, their faces hard, and then he saw the stepfather leading the girl towards them, towards the shed. A wave of nausea hit him. This was not just wrong. This was a nightmare unfolding before his eyes. The sight of the 3 additional men, their expressions predatory as they watched the stepfather approach with the small girl, sent a shockwave of pure horror through the bus driver. They weren't just rough, they were vultures circling. He froze, hidden by a thicket of trees, his breath catching in his chest. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not to her. The stepfather said something to the men, a low murmur that didn't carry. One of them laughed, a short, ugly sound that made the driver's stomach clench. Then, the stepfather took the girl by the arm, more forcefully this time, and pulled her towards the shed's dilapidated door. She stumbled, her small body rigid with what could only be terror. She didn't cry out, didn't make a sound, which was somehow more horrifying than if she had screamed. It was the silence of utter subjugation. One of the other men pushed open the creaking shed door, revealing a dark, uninviting interior. The driver watched, his heart hammering against his ribs as the stepfather forced the girl inside. The door closed behind them, shutting out the fading daylight, engulfing her in whatever horrors lay within that small, rotten building. The other 3 men lingered outside for a moment. Then 2 of them followed, disappearing into the shed. The last man stayed by the door, lighting a cigarette, his posture casual, yet vigilant. He was a sentinel guarding a place of unimaginable darkness. The driver felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made him tremble. His first instinct was to run out there, to scream, to fight. But he was one man. They were 4, and one was already acting as a lookout. He was unarmed, unprepared for a physical confrontation with men who looked like they lived by violence. If he rushed in, he might get himself killed, and he wouldn't save her. He might even make it worse, provoke them. Panic clawed at him, but he fought it down. He had to think. He had to do something smart, something that would actually help her. His hand fumbled for his phone in his pocket. His fingers were clumsy, shaking so badly he could barely grip it. Call 911. That was it. That was the only rational choice. He shrank further back into the shadows, his eyes glued to the shed, to the man standing guard. He couldn't risk being seen or heard. The minutes stretched, each one an agony. What was happening in there? The thought was a torment. He could hear faint sounds now, a low murmur of voices, a muffled thud. Or was it his imagination, his fear painting sounds onto the oppressive silence? He felt sick, a coiling dread in the pit of his stomach. He pictured her small face, her terrified eyes. He had to make the call, now. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let his fear paralyze him. He was her only hope right now. He had followed. He had seen. Now he had to act. He looked around, ensuring he was as concealed as possible. Then slowly, carefully, he pulled out his phone. The screen seemed blindingly bright in the dimming light of the woods. He shielded it with his body, his fingers trembling as he dialed the 3 numbers. Each beep of the keypad sounded deafening in the stillness. He prayed they wouldn't hear. He prayed the man by the door wouldn't look his way. The fate of the girl, trapped in that horrifying shed, rested on this call, on him remaining unseen, on help arriving in time. The dread was a living thing, coiling around his heart, but beneath it, a desperate resolve solidified. He had to save her. He pressed the call button, his ear pressed to the phone, waiting for the ring, his gaze fixed on the shed, a silent, terrible witness. The phone rang once, twice, each ring echoing in the bus driver's ears like a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet of the woods. He pressed the phone tighter to his ear, his other hand clenching into a fist, knuckles white. Finally, a calm voice. 911. What's your emergency? He could barely speak. His throat was dry, his voice a hoarse whisper. I need police. There's a girl, a little girl. She's been taken into a shed in the park by 4 men. He struggled to get the words out, his gaze darting between the shed and his surroundings, terrified of being discovered. Sir, can you tell me your location? The dispatcher's voice was professional, devoid of the panic that was consuming him. He tried to describe where he was. The old, neglected part of the park, the dilapidated maintenance shed near the overgrown eastern boundary. He gave the name of the park, the nearest cross streets he could remember. His mind raced, trying to provide clear, actionable information. How old is the girl, sir? I don't know, young. Maybe 9, 10? He wasn't sure. She always seemed so small, so vulnerable. And you said 4 men? Yes, her stepfather and 3 others. They took her inside. I think they're hurting her. The words were like acid in his mouth. He could hear the click of a keyboard on the other end of the line. Are they armed? Did you see any weapons? I don't know. I didn't see any, but they look dangerous. One of them is outside the shed, like a guard. He described the man, the shed, the isolation of the spot. Every detail felt crucial. Okay, sir. We're dispatching officers to your location. Can you stay on the line with me? Yes, he whispered, though every instinct screamed at him to hang up, to hide better, to make himself smaller, invisible. The minutes that followed were the longest of his life. He remained crouched in the bushes, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to the dispatcher's occasional questions, her reassurances that help was on the way. But time was stretching, distorting. Each second felt like an eternity. He kept his eyes fixed on the shed. The man outside was still there, smoking, occasionally pacing a short distance, and then returning to his post by the door. What was happening inside? The driver's imagination, fueled by fear and dread, conjured terrible images. He could hear faint, indistinct sounds from the shed. A muffled cry? A low laugh? He couldn't be sure. The wind rustling the leaves, the distant hum of traffic, his own ragged breathing. Everything conspired to mask the truth of what was transpiring in that dark place. He felt a profound sense of helplessness, a desperate impatience. Where were they? Why was it taking so long? He relayed his anxieties to the dispatcher in hushed tones. "They'll be there soon, sir. Try to stay calm and keep yourself safe. Do not approach them." He wasn't planning on it. His momentary surge of wanting to rush in had been replaced by a cold, calculated waiting. His only weapon now was his observation, his ability to guide the police when they arrived. Then, he heard it. A faint, distant siren. At first, he thought he was imagining it, hoping too hard. But then, it came again, closer this time, an unmistakable wail cutting through the evening air. Hope, sharp and desperate, pierced through his fear. They were coming. He whispered into the phone, "I hear sirens. I think they're close." The man outside the shed heard it too. He straightened up, dropping his cigarette, his head cocked, listening. He looked uneasy, peering into the trees. The driver held his breath. Would they find her in time? The sirens were getting louder, closer, converging on the park. The man by the shed door tensed, then turned and spoke sharply towards the closed door. The driver knew this was the critical moment. The fragile balance was about to break. The wail of the sirens grew louder, splitting the tense air, and the man guarding the shed door abruptly threw it open, shouting something urgent inside. The bus driver's heart leaped into his throat. This was it. There was a flurry of movement, shadows shifting in the dark doorway. He saw the police cars, lights flashing, pulling up along the park's edge, their beams cutting through the trees. Officers were already out, moving quickly, fanning out. The man who had been guarding the door looked panicked now. He darted back towards the shed, as if to warn the others more directly or perhaps to flee. But it was too late. "Police! Show me your hands!" The authoritative shout cut through the sounds of the woods and the dying sirens. The driver saw two officers, guns drawn, approaching the shed from different angles, their movements swift and professional. The lookout froze, his hands shooting up. More officers were converging. The driver remained hidden, his phone still pressed to his ear, though he wasn't speaking, just listening to the unfolding scene, his own breath catching in his chest. He heard orders being shouted, terse and clear. "Come out with your hands up!" There was a tense pause. Then the door of the shed was flung open from the inside. One by one, the men emerged, blinking in the sudden exposure, their faces a mixture of surprise, anger, and dawning fear. First the stepfather, his face grim, his eyes darting around. Then the other two, looking sullen and dangerous even with their hands raised. They were quickly surrounded, pushed against the shed wall, searched, and handcuffed. It happened fast, a blur of motion and commands. And then a small figure appeared in the doorway of the shed, hesitant, blinking against the flashing lights. The girl, she stood there, silhouetted against the darkness within, looking utterly lost and terrified. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair matted. She was trembling, her eyes wide and vacant. An officer approached her slowly, gently. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now." The girl didn't respond, just stared, as if she couldn't comprehend what was happening. The driver watched, a wave of profound relief washing over him, so potent it left him weak. It was quickly followed by a surge of rage at the men now being led away in handcuffs, and an overwhelming sorrow for the child, who had endured God knows what in that terrible place. He saw a female officer kneel by the girl, speaking to her in soft, reassuring tones. Slowly, the girl allowed herself to be led away from the shed, away from the scene of her torment. As she passed by the area where the driver was concealed, her gaze, unfocused and distant, swept across the bushes. For a fleeting second, her eyes seemed to meet his. Was there a flicker of recognition? Or was it just the blank stare of trauma? He couldn't be sure. He saw her being guided towards an ambulance that had pulled up, its red and white lights pulsing rhythmically in the fading light. He finally ended the call with the dispatcher, his hands shaking as he lowered the phone. He had done it. He had called. They had come. She was out. But the sight of her small, broken form being helped into the ambulance was an image that would be burned into his memory forever. He felt a profound weight settle on him, not of guilt anymore, but of a shared trauma, a knowledge of the darkness that could exist so close to the surface of ordinary life. He stayed hidden until most of J's XXQ, the activity died down, until the men were taken away, and the ambulance, carrying its precious, fragile cargo, pulled away, its own siren now silent. The woods felt quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, heavy with the residue of what had happened. He knew this wasn't the end. For the girl, it was just the beginning of a long, painful journey. The bus driver didn't go straight home. He couldn't. He found himself following the ambulance, keeping a respectful distance, his mind a turmoil of emotions. He needed to know she was truly safe, that she would be cared for. He parked his car across the street from the hospital emergency entrance, watching as she was gently helped out of the ambulance and taken inside. The fluorescent lights of the hospital seemed harsh and unforgiving after the gloom of the woods. He sat in his car for a long time, the engine off, just staring at the hospital doors. What now? His role in this, he thought, was over. He had made the call. She was rescued. But an invisible thread seemed to connect him to her, a sense of responsibility that hadn't dissipated with the arrival of the police. After about an hour, he saw a police car pull up, and two women got out, their faces etched with anxiety and confusion. He recognized one of them from the bus stop, the girl's mother. The other woman, older, with a stern but worried expression, he assumed was her grandmother. They hurried into the emergency room, their movements quick and agitated. He could only imagine the call they must have received, the nightmare they were walking into. He stayed. He didn't know why, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He felt like a silent sentinel, a distant guardian. More time passed. The night grew darker. Finally, a doctor, looking tired and grim, came out into the waiting area, and a little while later, he saw the mother and grandmother emerge from the main doors. The mother was sobbing, her body racked with grief, leaning heavily on the older woman, whose face was a mask of stoic devastation. Even from across the street, their anguish was palpable. It was clear they had received the worst possible news. He saw them talk to a police officer, their gestures conveying shock and horror. Then the mother crumpled, almost falling, and the grandmother held her, her own tears now visible. The driver's heart ached for them, for the girl, for the innocence that had been so brutally stolen. He knew, with a sinking feeling, what the doctors must have confirmed. The pills he had found were not just a random, insignificant detail. They were part of a larger, more horrifying picture. He learned later, through hushed whispers and solemn news reports that carefully omitted names but painted a clear enough picture for anyone who knew even a fraction of the story, the full extent of the horror. The hospital examination had confirmed the unthinkable. The young girl was pregnant. The stepfather, the man entrusted with her care, was responsible. The other men in the shed were his accomplices in a sustained campaign of abuse. The words hit the driver with the force of a physical blow, even though his gut had already told him something terrible had occurred. Pregnant. A child, barely on the cusp of her own childhood, forced to carry the consequence of such profound betrayal and violence. The discovery in the bus, the crying, the pills, it all coalesced into a truth more monstrous than he could have ever imagined. The cold dread he'd felt transformed into a burning, helpless anger. How could anyone do that to a child? How could a system, a community, allow a child to suffer so silently for so long? He thought of the girl's mother and grandmother. Their world had been shattered. The devastation he had witnessed outside the hospital was only the beginning of their pain. He felt a deep sense of sorrow for them, thrust into a nightmare no family should ever face. The confirmation of the pregnancy, the full, sickening scope of the abuse, settled like a shroud over everything. The rescue was a victory, yes, but it was a victory tainted by the profound, irreversible damage that had already been done. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations, grim faces, and the slow, grinding wheels of the justice system beginning to turn. The bus driver found himself drawn back to the hospital, not to interfere, but simply to be there, a silent presence in the background. He learned from a sympathetic nurse that the girl was physically stable but deeply traumatized, withdrawn into a shell of silence. Her mother and grandmother were constants by her bedside, their faces etched with a mixture of grief, fury, and a fierce, protective love. He saw them in the hospital cafeteria once, the mother's eyes red and swollen, the grandmother looking aged by a decade, yet with a new steel in her spine. He heard their voices, low and determined, vowing to protect her, to see justice done, no matter what it took. Their pain was a raw, open wound, but from it, a powerful resolve was emerging. They would not let this break their family. They would fight for the little girl who had lost her voice. The driver kept his distance, offering a silent nod if their eyes met, a gesture of solidarity that he hoped conveyed the depth of his concern without intruding on their private agony. He didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate, hollow in the face of such profound suffering. So, he just stayed, a quiet fixture in the periphery of their ordeal. He'd sit in the waiting room for a while, reading an old magazine, or just staring out the window, his thoughts consumed by the girl and her family. He brought a small, unopened coloring book and some crayons one day, leaving them with the nurse at the front desk, asking her to give them to the girl if she felt up to it, without saying who they were from. A small, anonymous gesture. He didn't expect thanks. He just wanted to do something, anything, to pierce the darkness, even in the smallest way. The nurse had smiled sadly, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. The news of the arrests had spread, though the details were kept under wraps to protect the victim. The stepfather and the other 3 men were in custody, facing a battery of horrific charges. The legal process would be long and arduous, another trial for the girl and her family to endure. But for now, they were off the streets. She was safe from them. That was the crucial first step. The driver replayed the events in his mind, over and over. The pills, the stepfather's denial, the decision to follow, the shed, the call. Had he done enough? Had he acted quickly enough? The what-ifs were a torment, but he pushed them away. He had done what he could, what he had to. He had seen something wrong, and he had not looked away. That was what mattered. One afternoon, as he was leaving the hospital, he saw the grandmother in the hallway. She looked tired, but her expression was resolute. She stopped him. "You're the bus driver, aren't you?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He nodded, unsure what to expect. "Thank you," she said, her eyes, though weary, holding a profound gratitude. "You saved her. You saved my granddaughter." Tears welled in her eyes and in his. He could only nod again, his throat tight with emotion. "We're going to get her through this," the grandmother continued, a fierce determination in her voice. "She's strong, stronger than any of them." He believed her. The family, shattered as they were, was drawing together, forming a protective shield around the girl, a bulwark of love against the darkness she had endured. Their vow was not just words, it was a promise etched in their hearts, a commitment to help her find her way back to the light, however long and difficult the path might be. The driver continued his route, the familiar streets now imbued with a different meaning. The yellow bus, once just a vehicle, felt like a silent witness to a story of profound sadness and unexpected courage. The girl's usual seat remained empty for a long time, a constant, poignant reminder of her absence, of what she had endured. Each time he passed it, a pang of sorrow, mixed with a quiet anger, would go through him. He checked in with the grandmother occasionally, brief phone calls, just to see how things were. He learned that the girl was slowly, painstakingly beginning her journey towards healing. There were good days and bad days. She was receiving therapy, surrounded by the unwavering love of her mother and grandmother. The legal proceedings were moving forward, a grim backdrop to their lives, but a necessary path towards accountability. The driver never asked for details about the girl's emotional state. He respected their privacy. But the grandmother would sometimes offer small snippets. A day the girl had smiled, a word she had spoken. Tiny victories, precious and hard-won. He found himself reflecting on his own actions. He was just an ordinary man, a bus driver. He had never imagined himself capable of such intervention, of playing a pivotal role in uncovering such a terrible crime. He had simply seen a child in pain, a child whose silent tears screamed for help, and he had chosen not to ignore them. That choice, that single decision to get involved, had changed everything. It had set in motion a chain of events that had pulled her from an ongoing nightmare. There was no glory in it, only a heavy sense of responsibility and a quiet satisfaction that he had done the right thing. He knew his life was also changed. He looked at the children on his bus differently now, more attuned to their silences, their unexpressed fears. He was more vigilant, his senses sharpened by the ordeal. He hoped he would never encounter such darkness again, but if he did, he knew he wouldn't hesitate. Months later, he heard that the girl and her family had moved to a new town, a chance for a fresh start, away from the shadows and whispers of the old neighborhood. He understood. They needed peace, a place where she could heal without constant reminders. He never saw her again. Sometimes, he would imagine her, older now, perhaps finding moments of joy, of normalcy. He hoped she was surrounded by people who cherished her, who helped her carry the burden of her past without letting it define her future. The driver knew that his act of courage hadn't erased her trauma, but it had given her a chance to live, to heal, to perhaps one day find her own voice again, strong and clear. The thought was a small comfort, a flicker of light in the lingering darkness of his memory. He often thought about the thin line between looking away and stepping in, and how one person's choice could make an immeasurable difference in the life of another. He had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it, and sometimes that was all it took to change the course of a life, to offer hope where there was only despair. His quiet guardianship had ended, but its impact, he hoped, would ripple outwards, a testament to the power of compassion in a world that often seemed too indifferent. The seasons changed. The driver continued his daily routes, the rhythm of the school year a familiar comfort. The raw edges of the memory had softened with time, but the weight of it remained, a permanent fixture in his heart. The girl's empty seat was eventually filled by other children, laughing, chattering, unaware of the silent story that seat held. Yet, for him, it would always be her seat. He thought of her often, a quiet prayer for her well-being, for her healing. He knew her path would be incredibly difficult. The physical and emotional scars of such profound abuse and betrayal would take a lifetime to manage, if not fully mend. There would be no simple, happy ending, no magic wand to wave away the darkness she had experienced. The pregnancy, a stark consequence of the horror, would forever tie her to that trauma, shaping her future in ways no child should ever have to confront. He imagined her mother and grandmother, their strength, their love, as the anchors in her turbulent life. Their fight was not just for justice in a courtroom, but for her spirit, for her right to a future where she could feel safe and, perhaps one day, whole again. It was a bittersweet reality. She was saved from the immediate danger, from the ongoing abuse. That was the undeniable victory, the direct result of his not looking away, of his decision to follow that gnawing feeling in his gut. The men responsible were facing the consequences of their heinous actions, the legal system slowly, methodically, working towards a resolution. But the damage was done. An innocence was shattered, a childhood irrevocably altered. There was a profound sadness in that, a tragic counterpoint to the relief of her rescue. He sometimes wondered about the other children on his bus. the ones who seemed quiet or withdrawn. He paid closer attention now, his awareness heightened. He knew that not all wounds were visible, not all cries for help were audible. His experience had taught him the importance of noticing, of caring, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it felt like overstepping. He understood now that the boundary he had once so carefully observed could also be a wall, shutting out the pleas of those who desperately needed someone to see them, to hear them. His choice had saved her from ongoing harm, yes. It had started her on a path to healing, however fraught and painful that path might be. There was a quiet, somber solace in that knowledge. He had not been a hero in a grand, dramatic sense, but a simple human being who had listened to his conscience and acted. The world was still a place where terrible things happened, but it was also a place where ordinary people could make a profound difference, sometimes just by paying attention, by refusing to be indifferent. The memory of the girl, her silent tears, the shed in the woods, would always be a part of him, a solemn reminder of the fragility of innocence and the enduring power of compassion. Her journey was hers to walk, but he hoped, with all his heart, that she found light in the shadows, and that the love of her family would guide her towards a future where peace was possible. Have you ever witnessed something that made you question if you should step in? Share your thoughts or experiences.